Amsterdam, November 1881. Late evening. The house of Pastor Stricker stands solid and respectable on a quiet street, its windows glowing with lamplight against the autumn chill. Inside, a man of 28 stands in the parlor. His red beard is unkempt. His clothes are worn thin at the elbows. His eyes burn with something that makes the elderly pastor step backward. The young man has come for a woman who has already told him no, a woman who fled to this very house to escape him. On the table between them, an oil lamp flickers. Without warning, the visitor extends his left hand directly over the flame. Let me see Key for as long as I can hold my hand in the fire. The smell of burning flesh fills the room. He does not pull away. His face shows nothing, no pain, no hesitation, only that terrible intensity in his eyes. Pastor Stricker lunges forward and extinguishes the lamp. Get out. You are a sick man. The young man stands in the sudden darkness, his hand blistering, his heart more damaged than his skin. He is lost again. He has lost everything again. 28 years old. No career, no family, no money, no woman who will have him. Within 9 years, this sick man would create some of the most valuable artwork in human history. But first, he would lose far more, including his sanity and part of his own body. His name was Vincent, and this is not a story about genius. This is a story about how love can burn a man to ashes long before any flame touches him. But to understand that night in Amsterdam, we must go back, 30 years back, to a small Dutch village and a grave that bore the name of a child who had not yet been born. The village of Groot Zundert lies in the southern Netherlands, close to the Belgian border. In 1852, it was a quiet place of farmers and tradespeople, its rhythm set by church bells and seasons. On the 30th of March that year, Anne van Gogh gave birth to a son. They named him Vincent William, after his grandfather. The baby was stillborn. They buried him in the churchyard, just steps from the parsonage door. A small headstone marked the grave, Vincent William van Gogh, 1852. Exactly 1 year later, on the 30th of March, 1853, Anna gave birth again. Another son. They gave him the same name, Vincent William van Gogh. This child lived. Imagine growing up in the shadow of your own grave. Every Sunday, walking to church with your family, passing a headstone that bears your name and your birthday. What does that do to a child's mind? Growing up as a replacement, carrying guilt for simply existing, trying to fill a space shaped by death. Anna never fully recovered from the loss of her first Vincent. She was present but somehow absent, devoted to her duties but emotionally unreachable. She gave birth to 5 more children, Theodorus in 1857, then Anna, Elizabeth, Wilhelmina, and Cornelius. But the eldest living son seemed always slightly apart, slightly unwanted. The parsonage was a house of Protestant discipline. Pastor Theodorus van Gogh was stern in his household. Meals began with prayers. Sundays were for church and reflection. Laughter was not forbidden, but neither was it encouraged. Young Vincent did not fit. From his earliest years, he was difficult, not disobedient exactly, but strange. He wandered the fields alone for hours. He collected insects and pressed flowers with disturbing intensity. He drew pictures obsessively, showing them to no one. When other children played, he watched from a distance, studying a species he did not belong to. "That child will be a problem," his father reportedly said. It was not a prediction. It was a verdict. One afternoon, Pastor Van Gogh found his 8-year-old son hunched over a piece of paper, sketching with a stub of pencil. "What is that?" "A bird. A dead bird I found by the road." "Why draw something dead?" The boy looked up, his pale blue eyes unreadable. "So it will stay." He learned to draw dead things so they would remain. Later, he would draw living things, fields and faces, sunflowers and stars, so that he himself might remain, might matter, might finally be something other than a replacement for a ghost. If Vincent had an ally in that house of quiet disapproval, it was his younger brother. Theodorus, called Theo, was born in May 1857, for years after Vincent. Where Vincent was awkward and intense, Theo was charming and adaptable. They were opposites in temperament, but bound by something stronger than similarity. From their earliest years, the brothers were inseparable. They walked the fields around Grootzundern, collecting specimens, sharing secrets, building a private world against the incomprehensible universe of adults. "We are a team," Vincent told his brother. "You and me against everyone." It was more than a childhood bond. It was a lifeline. For Vincent, who felt unloved by his mother and judged by his father, Theo was proof that connection was possible. Someone in the world could see him and not flinch. More than 800 letters from Vincent to Theo survive today, the most extensive correspondence in the history of art. They document everything: struggles and triumphs, artistic theories and daily meals. They are a direct line into the mind of a genius, written not for posterity, but for the only person he trusted completely. But the letters also reveal a dependency that bordered on desperation. Vincent needed Theo emotionally, financially, existentially. Their bond would sustain them both. It would also, perhaps, destroy them both. The Van Gogh family carried. Cornelis would take his own life in South Africa, and Vincent himself would die under circumstances still debated today. Was there something in the blood? Some hereditary fragility? Or was it the weight of that household? The distant mother, the judging father, the ghost of the child who died before any of them were born. In 1869, at 16, Vincent left home to begin his working life. His uncle, also named Vincent and known as Uncle Sant, was a successful art dealer. He arranged for his nephew to join the Hague branch of Goupil and Company, an international firm dealing in artwork. The early years proved successful. Young Vincent was diligent and knowledgeable. He learned about art as a merchant, studying what sold and why. His employers were satisfied. His family was relieved. Perhaps the strange boy would become respectable after all. In 1873, the firm transferred him to London. A promotion. Vincent was 20 years old, far from home, in one of the great cities of the world. He took lodgings with a widow named Sarah Ursula Lawyer and her daughter Eugenie. Within months, he was in love. This was his pattern, already forming. He fell hard, completely, without reservation. He did not court Eugenie gradually. He simply loved her with all the intensity he brought to everything, and assumed such love must be returned. It was not. Eugenie was engaged to another man. When Vincent declared himself, she rejected him with the finality of someone who had never considered him a possibility. He was shattered. His work suffered. He became sullen, argumentative with clients. He lectured customers on their poor taste instead of selling them what they wanted. His superiors transferred him to Paris, hoping a change might help. It did not. In 1876, Goupil's dismissed him. "You are too honest for this business," one employer told him. Vincent heard it as another rejection, another proof that he did not belong in the normal world. The years between 1876 and 1880 were the darkest of his life. Not dark with drama, but with drift, with purposelessness. Teaching came first. A cramped school in Ramsgate, then Isleworth. The pay was nothing, room and board, no more. But they let him preach to the students, and something ignited. Standing before those young faces, speaking of God and salvation, he felt purpose for the first time. He tried bookselling in Dordrecht, but spent more time reading merchandise than selling it. He tried theology in Amsterdam, studying obsessively for entrance examinations. He failed. Finally, in 1879, he talked his way into a mission in the Borinage, a coal-mining region in southern Belgium. The people there were desperately poor, working in conditions of unimaginable hardship. Vincent threw himself into the work with characteristic totality. He gave away everything: clothes, money, food. He lived in a hovel. He slept on straw. He went down into the mines with the workers, crawled through tunnels, breathed black dust. The locals called him the Christ of the coal mines. A miner looked at him one evening, both covered in the same coal dust. "You're not like the other priests." "I'm not a priest." "Then what are you?" Vincent had no answer. He was still searching, but the church authorities were not pleased. A minister was supposed to maintain dignity. This wild-eyed Dutchman living in filth, looking more beggar than clergyman. He was an embarrassment. They dismissed him for excessive zeal, for being too Christian for the Christian church. 26 years old. Every path closed. His father spoke openly of having him committed to an asylum. His mother could barely look at him. Only Theo remained. Working at Goupil's in Paris now, he sent money and letters. He asked the question that would change everything: "What are you going to do?" And Vincent, out of the darkness, found an answer: "Perhaps I should become a painter." It was August 1880. Vincent van Gogh was 27 years old. No formal training, no connections, no money, no studio, no prospects. But he had Theo. The brothers made an arrangement. Theo would send a monthly allowance, between 150 and 250 francs. Vincent would work at his craft and send artwork in return. Not charity, a partnership, a bet on unproven talent. For the next 10 years, until the day he died, Vincent would depend on his brother's support. He would produce more than 2,000 works. He would sell, during his lifetime, exactly one canvas. He was so poor that he reused canvases, painting over earlier work when he could not afford new materials. He copied masterworks to teach himself technique. He drew the miners and weavers of Belgium, learning from the ground up. He had found his calling at last. Now it would consume him. The autumn of 1881 found Vincent staying with his parents in Etten. He was working on his drawing, still dependent on Theo's payments, when a visitor came to stay. Eva Stricker was his cousin, daughter of Pastor Stricker of Amsterdam. A widow with a young son, still in mourning, still fragile, wrapped in black. Vincent fell in love instantly. It was not gradual. It was the same consuming intensity he had shone with Eugenie. He saw Key and decided this woman would save him. He followed her constantly. He sought her out for conversations. He stared with that unnerving focus that made people uncomfortable. He declared his feelings, not subtly, but with the full force of his desperate need. Her response was immediate and absolute. Nut, nie nimmer. Never, no, never. 3 words in Dutch. 3 negatives, emphatic and final. She fled to Amsterdam, to her father's house, to escape him. Vincent followed. He appeared at Pastor Stricker's door, demanding to see her. The scene with the lamp, the burning hand, the extinguished flame, was his answer. He walked the dark Amsterdam streets afterward, hand blistering, heart broken. Sick, the pastor had called him. Not strange, not difficult, sick. Something wrong at a fundamental level. The incident caused a permanent rift with that branch of the family. More importantly, it established a pattern. He loved too hard. He gave too much. He frightened the people he wanted to draw close. When they rejected him, he was not merely disappointed. He was devastated. If not her, he wrote to Theo, then anyone. He did not mean defeat. He meant defiance. If respectable women would not have him, he would find someone else. Someone who could not afford to refuse. The Hague, January 1882. A cold night on a working-class street. Vincent was walking back to his rented room when he saw her. She stood under a street lamp, obviously for hire. A prostitute, thin and worn, her face marked with old smallpox scars. She was visibly pregnant. A small girl, 5 years old, perhaps, clutched at her ragged skirt. Her name was Clasina Maria Hornick. People called her Seed. She was 32 years old. She had been selling herself since adolescence. She drank too much. She had no prospects, no protector, no future that did not end in the gutter or the hospital. Vincent saw her and thought, I can save this woman. He took her home that night. Not primarily for sex. He took her because she was fallen and he wanted to raise her up. Because she was abandoned and he had been abandoned too. Because saving her might prove that he was worth something after all. Within weeks, she had moved in with him. Her daughter, and the baby growing in her belly. Vincent set up house with a prostitute, her illegitimate child, and an unborn baby that was certainly not his. The scandal was immense. His parents were horrified. His father spoke of disowning him, of legal action, of commitment to an asylum. His mother wept and prayed and refused to write. Anton Mauve was the closest thing Vincent had to a teacher, an established painter who had taken him under his wing, shown him technique, opened doors to collectors. When he learned about scene, he slammed every door shut. No more lessons. No more introductions. Vincent was on his own. Even Theo was appalled. This will destroy you, he wrote. This will destroy everything we're working toward. Vincent's response was fierce. Christ went to the fallen. Am I better than Christ? It was the bondage all over again. Excessive identification with the lowest, excessive willingness to throw away his future for a principle. But this time the principle was not salvation through preaching. It was salvation through love, through domesticity, through the radical act of treating a prostitute as a human being worthy of family. Singh gave birth to a son, Willem. Vincent was not the father. That was some unknown client. But he cared for the boy as if he were his own. He drew Scene obsessively. Her tired body, her worn face, her posture
of defeat. One drawing, which he titled Sorrow, shows her naked and pregnant, head bowed, body a map of suffering. It is one of the most powerful images of his early career. He wrote beneath it a line from a French historian. How can there be on earth a woman alone, abandoned? For almost 18 months, they lived together. He tried to reform her, to stop her drinking, to keep her from returning to the streets when money was short. She tried to be what he wanted, but she could not. She was an alcoholic with no education, no skills, no experience of any life except the one he was trying to pull her from. She slipped back into old habits. She resented his moralizing. She needed money more than redemption. One evening, after another argument about her drinking, she looked at him with exhausted eyes. "You want to save me. But what if I don't want to be saved?" He had no answer. He had never considered the question. In September 1883, Vincent left. Theo had insisted, had threatened to cut off the allowance. The family had won. Respectability had won. Scene returned to the streets. She continued drinking, continued selling herself, continued the slow decline that had been her trajectory before Vincent found her. In 1904, 21 years after he left her, she threw herself into a canal in Rotterdam and drowned. She was 54 years old. Did she think of him in those final moments? Did she remember the strange, intense man who had tried to save her and failed? There is no way to know. What we know is this: Vincent tried to rescue a fallen woman. Instead, he joined the long list of men who used her and moved on. His intentions were different, perhaps. His heart was better. But the result was the same. She drowned, and he was not there. Noonan, 1884. Vincent was living with his parents again, an uncomfortable arrangement for everyone, and trying to advance his art. He was painting peasants now, farmers at their meals, weavers at their looms. A neighbor caught his attention. Her name was Margot Bergman. She was 43 years old, unmarried, living with her family next door to the parsonage. Plain, considered a spinster, with no prospects of marriage at her age. She was invisible to most men. But she saw Vincent. She saw past the wild beard and the paint-stained clothes to something worth loving. It was perhaps the only time in his life that a woman initiated the relationship, that he was pursued rather than pursuer. Margot believed in him. She wanted him. Their courtship was quiet, almost secretive. Walks in the evening. Conversations about art and life. For a few months, Vincent allowed himself to imagine something he had never imagined: a normal future. A wife. A home. Children, perhaps. He responded to her attention, out of loneliness, perhaps, or gratitude, or simply the relief of being wanted for once. They talked of marriage. They made plans. Both families opposed the match. The Bergman family considered Vincent a penniless failure, unsuitable for their daughter despite her age and lack of alternatives. What future could he offer? He earned nothing. He depended on his brother's charity. He was, by any reasonable measure, a terrible prospect. The Van Gogh family, still reeling from the scene scandal, could not bear another disgrace. Pastor Van Gogh made clear his opposition. Another unsuitable woman. Another embarrassment. Margot's relatives forbade the marriage. Her sisters mocked her. Her mother threatened to disown her. And Margot, caught between her love and her family, unable to defy them and unable to give up Vincent, made a choice. She swallowed strychnine. It happened during one of their walks. She had brought the poison with her, hidden in her clothes. She collapsed in the field, convulsing, foam at her lips. It was Vincent who found her seizing on the ground. Vincent who lifted her in his arms. Vincent who ran to the doctor, shouting for help, feeling her body jerk against his chest. They pumped the poison from her stomach. She survived, barely, but the relationship was over. Her family blamed him for driving her to suicide. His family blamed him for the scandal. The whispers followed him everywhere. The painter whose women tried to die. He left Nuenen soon after, fleeing yet another catastrophe. 3 women in 3 years. He, who fled from him. Scene, whom he abandoned. Margot, who tried to die rather than lose him. Every time he reached for love, someone was destroyed. If not him, then the woman foolish or desperate enough to come close. "I am poison," he wrote to Theo. It was not self-pity. It was observation. Everywhere he went, disaster followed. On the 26th of March, 1885, Pastor Theodorus Van Gogh collapsed on the threshold of the parsonage. He was returning from a walk when his heart gave out. He was dead within moments. Vincent was home when it happened. He watched them carry his father's body inside. He stood in the doorway as his mother wept, as his sisters gathered, as the house filled with grief. He did not cry. The relationship between father and son had been strained for years, since Key, since Scene, since every choice Vincent made that disappointed his father's expectations. They had argued about religion, about art, about money, about everything. The pastor had wanted to have his son committed. The son had called his father's faith a prison. Now the patriarch was gone. Within days, Vincent painted a still life. A large Bible lies open on a table, heavy and authoritative, his father's Bible, the symbol of the faith Theodorus had devoted his life to. The candle beside it has been extinguished, and next to the Bible, smaller and slightly tattered, lies a French novel, Émile Zola's La Joie de Vivre, The Joy of Living. It was a statement, perhaps the clearest artistic statement of his life to that point. The old world, religion, duty, the father's authority, was dead. The candle was out. The new world, literature, art, a different way of seeing, had arrived. His father died without forgiving him. Vincent answered with a canvas instead of tears. There was nothing more to say. The months following his father's death brought no peace. Vincent remained in Nuenen through the autumn of 1885, working furiously on what would become his first masterpiece. He called it The Potato Eaters. 5 peasants sit around a rough wooden table in a dim cottage, eating their evening meal. A single oil lamp illuminates their faces, faces that are not beautiful, not idealized, but harsh and worn. The heavy features of people who work the earth with their hands. They eat what they have grown. Their poverty is complete, their dignity unbroken. Vincent labored over this canvas for months, making study after study, struggling to capture something true about these people he had lived among. I have tried to emphasize that those people, eating their potatoes in the lamplight, have dug the earth with those very hands they put in the dish, he wrote to Theo. So it speaks of manual labor, and how they have honestly earned their food. The work was dark, too dark for the tastes of the time. The figures were ugly, deliberately ugly, Vincent insisted, because beauty was not the point. Truth was the point. Humanity was the point. Critics dismissed it. Buyers ignored it. Even Theo, trying to sell his brother's work in Paris, could not find interest. But Vincent had found his voice. In that dim cottage, among those exhausted peasants, he had discovered what he wanted to say with paint. It would take 3 more years for his style to mature, for color to explode across his canvases. But The Potato Eaters was the foundation. Everything that followed grew from that room and those honest hands. In February 1886, Vincent arrived in Paris without warning. He sent Theo a note. "Meet me at the Louvre, in the Salon Care, at noon." It was typical of him, impulsive, demanding, assuming his brother would rearrange his life to accommodate him. Theo did, as he always did. From that day forward, for 2 years, the brothers lived together in a small apartment on Montmartre. Paris in the 1880s was the center of the art world, intoxicated with new ideas and new ways of seeing. The Impressionists had scandalized the establishment with their loose brushwork. Now a younger generation was pushing further, Neo-Impressionists with their scientific dots of color, symbolists with their dreams and mysteries. Vincent plunged into this world with his usual intensity. He met everyone worth meeting. In a Montmartre café, thick with cigarette smoke, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec watched Vincent argue with Paul Signac about color theory. The Dutchman's voice rose. His hands gestured wildly. Other patrons turned to stare. Toulouse-Lautrec leaned toward Theo, who sat nursing a drink and a headache. "Your brother is insane," he said, not unkindly. "I know. He might also be brilliant. I know that too." Vincent argued about art in cafes, studied Japanese prints with obsessive focus, experimented with techniques he had never imagined in his Dutch years. His palette transformed. The dark earth tones of the Potato Eaters gave way to brilliant yellows and blues. He discovered color not as decoration, but as emotion, a way of expressing feelings that words could not capture. He painted flowers, self-portraits, street scenes, cafe interiors. Anything and everything, learning with each canvas. But living with Vincent was nearly impossible. He was argumentative and moody. He lectured Theo's friends until they avoided the apartment. He drank too much absinthe. He picked fights with other painters over theoretical disagreements. He filled their small rooms with canvases and the smell of turpentine. He demanded attention, then withdrew into sullen silence. "Living with him is almost unbearable," Theo wrote to their sister Wilhelmina. "He makes my life a burden, but I cannot abandon him. He is my brother, and there is genius in him, whatever his faults." The genius was real. Anyone who looked at Vincent's work could see that something extraordinary was emerging. But the man himself was exhausting. A whirlwind of need and brilliance that left everyone around him drained. By winter of 1887, both brothers knew something had to change. Vincent needed space to develop without the distractions of Paris. Theo needed space to breathe, to live his own life. "I am thinking of going south," Vincent told his brother. "To Provence. They say the light there is like Japan." He had never been to Japan. He never would. But he had fallen in love with Japanese woodblock prints, their flat planes of color, their bold outlines, their way of making the ordinary luminous. He imagined that somewhere in the south of France, he would find that same quality of light. In February 1888, he boarded a train heading south. He was 34 years old, unknown, unsold, supported entirely by his brother's money. He was going to a place he had never seen, chasing a vision he could not articulate. He was going to Alls, and nothing would ever be the same. The town of Alls sits in the Rhone Delta, an ancient place of Roman ruins and medieval churches, surrounded by flat fields stretching toward the Mediterranean. When Vincent arrived in late February, snow still lay on the ground. Unusual for Provence, a sign that the famous Southern Light would have to wait. He did not mind. He rented rooms in a hotel, then found something better, the right wing of a building on the Place Lamartine. The building was painted yellow, bright against the blue sky. He called it the Yellow House. For the first time in his life, he had a space of his own. Not a rented room in someone else's home. Not a corner of his parents' parsonage. A house. His house. A place where he could work and sleep and dream without interference. He began to paint with a fury that astonished even himself. In 15 months in Alls, Vincent would produce approximately 200 canvases, more than one every 3 days. Sunflowers blazing against yellow backgrounds. The night sky over the Rhone, stars reflected in dark water. A cafe terrace at evening, warm light spilling onto cobblestones. His own bedroom, with its simple bed and wooden chairs, rendered in colors that seemed to vibrate with life. Yellow dominated everything. The sunflowers were yellow. The house was yellow. The wheat fields surrounding the town were yellow. Even the night seemed touched with golden light. Why yellow? Some have suggested medical explanations, that digitalis, a medication he may have taken, can cause yellow-tinted vision. Others point to the absinthe he drank heavily, which contains thujone, a chemical that might affect color perception. Perhaps yellow was simply the color of the light he had been seeking. The visual equivalent of joy, of warmth, of the life force he felt flowing through him in those electric months. "I am working like a man possessed," he wrote to Theo. "More than ever, I am in a frenzy of work." The canvases poured out of him. Orchards in bloom. Fishing boats on the beach at St. Mary's. Portrait after portrait of the postman Rulin and his family, of a Dzo soldier, of a young girl he called La Musum. He painted the same subjects again and again, exploring them from different angles, in different lights, with different palettes. But he was lonely, desperately lonely. He had come to Alls not just for the light, but for a dream, a colony of artists, a community of painters who would work together, support each other, create a new kind of art in the southern sun. He wanted company. He wanted collaboration. He wanted a friend. He wanted Gauguin. Paul Gauguin was everything Vincent was not: worldly, confident, charismatic. A former stockbroker who had abandoned bourgeois life for art, he had traveled to Panama and Martinique, had developed a style of bold colors and simplified forms that critics were beginning to notice. He was 40 years old, 5 years older than Vincent, and carried himself with the authority of a man who knew his own worth. Vincent had met him briefly in Paris and been dazzled. Here was an artist who seemed to have solved the problems that tormented Vincent: how to be original, how to be bold, how to create without constant self-doubt. He began writing to Gauguin, urging him to come to Alls, to join him in the Yellow House, to help build the artist colony he dreamed of. Gauguin was not interested. He was struggling financially, but had no desire to bury himself in a provincial town with an unstable Dutchman. He made excuses. He delayed. Theo intervened. He offered Gauguin a deal. Come to Alls, live with Vincent, and Theo would buy his work, provide a monthly stipend, help establish his career. It was an offer Gauguin could not refuse. On the 23rd of October, 1888, Paul Gauguin arrived at the Yellow House. Vincent had prepared for weeks. He had painted sunflowers specifically to decorate Gauguin's room. Those now famous canvases of yellow blooms in yellow vases against yellow backgrounds. He had bought furniture, arranged the studio, stocked provisions. He was, in effect, preparing for a marriage. The first days were promising. They painted together, discussed art, explored the town and its surroundings. Two brilliant men working side by side, pushing each other to new insights. But the differences between them were fundamental. Gauguin believed in painting from imagination, from memory, from the inner vision of the artist. He worked in the studio, constructing images from his mind. Vincent believed in painting from nature, from direct observation, from the thing itself. He worked outdoors, easel planted in the fields, capturing what he saw before him. They argued about technique, about color theory, about the very purpose of art. They argued about money. Gauguin took control of household finances and criticized Vincent's spending. They argued about everything, with increasing intensity as the weeks passed. Our arguments are terribly electric, Vincent wrote to Theo. Sometimes we come out of them with our heads as exhausted as a used electric battery. Gauguin wrote his own letters, his own complaints. Vincent was unstable. Vincent was impossible. And there was something else. Something that disturbed Gauguin deeply. Vincent stood over his bed at night, watching him sleep. Gauguin would wake in darkness and find the Dutchman there, motionless, staring down at him with those intense pale eyes. The first time it happened, Gauguin thought he was dreaming. The second time, he was certain he was not. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Vincent said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, "Checking that you're still here." "I'm leaving," Gauguin said. This cannot continue. The tensions built through November and into December. Two strong personalities, two incompatible visions, trapped together in a small house as winter closed in. 63 days. That was all they had together. 63 days from Gauguin's arrival to the catastrophe that would end everything. The night of December 23rd, 1888. The events of that evening would become one of the most famous incidents in the history of art and one of the most debated. What is certain, Vincent and Gauguin argued that day. The argument was about art, about women, about leaving. Gauguin had announced his intention to depart, to abandon the Yellow House and the dream it represented. Vincent was distraught. The colony he had imagined, the friendship he had craved, the future he had built in his mind, all of it was crumbling. In the evening, Gauguin went out for a walk. What happened next depends on which account you believe. According to Gauguin, he was crossing a public square when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw Vincent approaching, a razor in his hand. Gauguin stared him down. Vincent stopped, turned, and went back to the Yellow House. Gauguin spent the night at a hotel, afraid to return. The next morning, police found Vincent in his bed, unconscious and covered in blood. He had cut off the lower portion of his left ear, not the entire ear, as legend has it, but a significant piece nonetheless. He had wrapped the severed flesh in newspaper and taken it to a brothel, where he presented it to a woman. Her name was Rachel, or perhaps Gabrielle. The sources disagree. Guard this object carefully, he told her. Then he went home to bleed. This is the official version, the one accepted by the Van Gogh Museum and most historians. Vincent, in a fit of psychological crisis, mutilated himself. But there are doubts. In 2009, German historians Hans Kaufmann and Rita Wildgans proposed an alternative theory. Gauguin, they noted, was an accomplished fencer. He carried a fencing foil. What if, in the confrontation that night, Gauguin had drawn his weapon? What if he had cut off Vincent's ear, accidentally or deliberately? If so, both men might have agreed to keep silent. Gauguin would have avoided prosecution. Vincent would have protected his friend, preserved some hope of reconciliation. The Van Gogh Museum rejects this theory as speculation unsupported by solid evidence. Most scholars agree, but the questions linger. The wound's location, Gauguin's hasty departure, his refusal ever to see Vincent again. What is certain is this: Gauguin left Arles the next day and never returned. He never visited Vincent, never wrote to him, never expressed regret or concern. Their friendship, if friendship it was, ended in blood on that December night. And Vincent? He was taken to the hospital in Arles, where doctors treated his wound and tried to understand what had happened to his mind. He would never fully recover. The weeks following the incident were a nightmare of hospital rooms and uncertain diagnoses. Vincent suffered episodes of intense confusion alternating with periods of complete lucidity. He could paint one day and be incapable of speech the next. The doctors called it acute mania with hallucinations. They had no real treatment to offer, only observation and restraint. When he was well enough, he returned to the yellow house and tried to work, but his neighbors were frightened. A petition circulated through Arles. 30 signatures. 30 neighbors who had smiled at him on the street, bought bread from the same baker, nodded in greeting. Now they wanted him gone. The madman, the ear cutter, the danger to their children. Vincent read the petition in the hospital, still bandaged, still weak. He did not blame them. He understood fear. He had lived with it his entire life. The police complied with the petition. The yellow house was closed. Vincent's belongings were packed up. He was effectively exiled from the town he had come to love, the place where he had created some of his greatest work. In February 1889, he suffered another severe episode. It was clear now that he could not live alone, could not be trusted to care for himself. Something was deeply wrong, something that would not simply go away. On the 8th of May, 1889, Vincent voluntarily committed himself to the St. Paul de Mossel Asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. It was a former monastery, a quiet place of stone walls and olive groves, where patients could wander the gardens and receive what passed for psychiatric care in that era: rest, baths, minimal stimulation. He was given a small room with barred windows looking out over wheat fields. He was given a second room to use as a studio. He was, in effect, a prisoner, but a prisoner who could paint. And paint he did. During his year at Saint Remy, Vincent produced approximately 150 works, including some of the most recognizable images in Western art. He painted the olive trees surrounding the asylum, their twisted trunks and silver leaves. He painted cypress trees, those dark flames reaching toward the sky that would become one of his signatures. He painted irises and roses, the hospital corridor, the faces of attendants who watched over him. And he painted the Starry Night. The canvas shows a village at night, huddled beneath a sky that swirls with motion. Stars blaze like pinwheels. The moon radiates light in concentric circles. A great cypress tree rises in the foreground, connecting earth and heaven. The whole scene pulses with energy, as if the universe itself were alive and breathing. Vincent painted it in June 1889, during or shortly after one of his episodes. He did not think much of it at the time. "The sight of the stars makes me dream," he wrote to Theo, but he dismissed this particular canvas as a failure, an experiment that had not quite worked. Today, it is one of the most famous images in human history, reproduced on posters and coffee cups and dormitory walls everywhere. People who know nothing else about Vincent van Gogh know the Starry Night. They recognize in its swirling patterns something that speaks to them. Chaos transformed into beauty, suffering made luminous. But for Vincent, in his small room in the asylum, there was no triumph. Only the endless cycle of crisis and recovery, the desperate attempt to keep working while his mind betrayed him. During one episode, he tried to poison himself by eating his paints and drinking turpentine. The doctor saved him, barely. It would not be the last time he attempted to end his life. In January 1890, a piece of good news arrived. An art critic named Albert Aurier had published an article praising Vincent's work in the journal Mercure de France. It was the first serious critical attention he had ever received. And there was more. Theo wrote to tell him that a canvas had sold. The Red Vineyard, painted in Alls, had been purchased by a Belgian artist named Annebach for 400 francs. One painting, 400 francs. After 10 years of work, after more than 2,000 pieces, one sale. Vincent responded with characteristic ambivalence. He was glad, of course, but he worried that success would change something, would create pressures he could not handle. He was not built for recognition. He was built for struggle. Another letter arrived that same month, carrying different news. Theo had a son. They named him Vincent Willem, after his uncle, after the dead baby who had come before. In his small room at the asylum, Vincent wept. Not from sadness, from something harder to name. His name would continue. Something of him would live on, even if he did not. "I hope he has a soul less troubled than mine," he wrote back. It was the closest thing to a blessing he knew how to give. In May 1890, after a year in the asylum, he felt well enough to leave. Theo had found a place for him, the village of Auvers-sur-Oise, about an hour from Paris. A doctor there, Paul Gauguin, specialized in nervous conditions and was sympathetic to artists. It seemed like a hopeful new beginning. The asylum had stabilized him. He was producing good work. Perhaps the worst was over. On the 20th of May, 1890, Vincent arrived in Auvers. He had 70 days to live. Auvers-sur-Oise was a quiet village of thatched cottages and wheat fields, perched above the Oise River about 20 miles northwest of Paris. Artists had been coming there for decades, attracted by picturesque scenery and cheap rents. Daubigny had painted there. Pissarro had worked nearby. It was a place where a painter could find subjects in solitude. Dr. Paul Gauguin met Vincent soon after his arrival. He was 62 years old, a physician who had specialized in nervous disorders, but who was himself prone to melancholy. He was also an amateur artist and a serious collector, with works by Pissarro, Cezanne, and others hanging on his walls. He charged Vincent nothing for his services, seeing in him a kindred spirit. Vincent was not entirely convinced. "He seems sicker than I am," he wrote to Theo. "The blind leading the blind." But he painted Gauguin's portrait, twice, in fact. The second version shows the doctor resting his head on his hand, his expression infinitely sad. Vincent called it the face of our time. That portrait would eventually become one of the most valuable canvases in history, selling at auction in 1990 for $82.5 million. The doctor who could not heal his patient became immortal through the patient's brush. In those final weeks, Vincent worked with productivity that bordered on frenzy. 70 paintings in 70 days, one per day, sometimes more. Wheat fields under threatening skies. The church at Auvers, its architecture distorted as if seen through troubled water. Thatched cottages, gardens, portraits of the innkeeper's daughter. He painted as if he knew time was running out. Perhaps he did. The letters from this period show a man aware that he was a burden. Theo was struggling financially, supporting a wife and infant son on an art dealer's modest salary, while also sending money to Vincent. There had been talk of reducing the monthly allowance. Vincent felt the pressure. He felt himself to be an anchor dragging his brother down. "I try to be of good courage," he wrote, "but my life is also threatened at the very root, and my steps are also wavering." The wheat fields around Auvers ripened toward harvest. Golden and heavy, they swayed in summer winds beneath skies that shifted from blue to gray to threatening purple. Vincent painted them obsessively. Those endless horizons, those paths leading nowhere, those crows circling overhead. One canvas from these final days shows a wheat field beneath a turbulent sky, 3 paths diverging into the golden grain, black crows rising or descending. It is impossible to tell which. He called it simply Wheatfield with Crows. Some have read it as a suicide note rendered in oil. Others see only another landscape, no more ominous than dozens he had painted before. The truth, as always with Vincent, remains elusive. On the 27th of July, 1890, a Sunday, Vincent went out into the fields with his painting materials. What happened next has been debated for more than a century. The traditional account, accepted by the Van Gogh Museum and most historians, is that Vincent shot himself. He had obtained a revolver, from where, exactly, is unclear, and fired a single bullet into his chest. Not his head, which would have been more certain. His chest, which left him wounded but alive. He managed to walk back to the inn where he was staying, the Albert's Revue. The innkeeper found him collapsed on his bed, bleeding through his clothes. "I have wounded myself," Vincent said. They sent for a doctor. There was nothing to be done. The bullet had lodged somewhere that could not be reached. Removing it would kill him faster than leaving it in place. They sent word to Theo in Paris. There is, however, another theory. In 2011, biographers Stephen Nafee and Gregory White-Smith proposed that Vincent's death was not suicide but something else entirely. Their argument centered on 2 local teenagers, René and Gaston Secretan. The boys were known to torment Vincent, mocking his appearance and behavior, playing pranks on the strange Dutchman. René Secretan owned an old, malfunctioning pistol that he liked to show off. According to this theory, Vincent was shot by the boys, accidentally or in a confrontation, and chose to take the blame himself. By claiming suicide, he protected the teenagers from prosecution. Perhaps he also found a way to die that was not quite self-murder, a death he could accept, that released Theo from the burden of supporting him, that ended his torment without the explicit sin of taking his own life. The evidence is circumstantial. René Secretan, interviewed decades later, gave evasive and contradictory accounts. The gun was never found. The wound's angle was odd for a self-inflicted shot. Vincent's painting materials were never recovered from the fields. But most experts remain unconvinced. The Van Gogh Museum maintains that evidence for suicide is stronger than evidence for any alternative. Vincent had a history of self-harm. He had spoken of wanting to die. He told people he had shot himself. The truth may never be known with certainty. What is certain is what happened next. Theo arrived the following morning and found his brother conscious, smoking his pipe, apparently calm despite the bullet in his chest. They spent the day together, talking. Two brothers who had shared everything, poverty and hope, disappointment and dreams, sharing now the final hours. Vincent spoke of wanting to die, of feeling that his life had become impossible, of the weight he had placed on Theo for so many years. "Do not cry," he told his brother. "I did this for the good of everyone." Whether this meant the shooting or the dying or simply the release from burden, he did not explain. At approximately 1:30 in the morning on July 29, 1890, Vincent van Gogh died. He was 37 years old. His last words, according to Theo, were in French, "La tristesse durera toujours." The sadness will last forever. The funeral was held the next day. A small affair, hastily organized. The local Catholic priest refused to allow the church hearse for a suicide, so they borrowed one from a neighboring village. The coffin was placed in the room where Vincent had been painting, surrounded by his last canvases. Yellow sunflowers, golden wheat fields. The blazing colors he had loved seemed to glow against the white walls. A final exhibition that no one had planned. Those who came were few. Theo, devastated beyond words. Dr. Gauguin, weeping openly. A handful of artists from Paris, Émile Bernard, perhaps a dozen others. "He was an honest man and a great artist," Gauguin said through his tears. "He had only two aims, humanity and art. Art will make his name live." They buried him in the cemetery above Auvers, on a hillside overlooking the wheat fields he had painted in his final days. A simple grave, marked by a plain headstone. Theo returned to Paris a broken man. For 10 years, his life had been organized around Vincent, sending money, selling work, providing the emotional support that kept the artist going. Now that mission was over. The letters would stop. The canvases would stop arriving. The brilliant, impossible, beloved brother was gone. Within weeks, Theo began showing signs of collapse. He became agitated, irrational. He quarreled with his employers. He spoke of grandiose plans to open his own gallery, to finally give Vincent's work the recognition it deserved. Then he would sink into despair, unable to function. In October 1890, less than 3 months after Vincent's death, Theo was hospitalized. The diagnosis was dementia paralytica, a term that usually indicated advanced syphilis attacking the brain. He was transferred to a clinic in Utrecht, closer to his family. He did not recognize visitors. He could not speak coherently. The brothers' deaths, both struck down by diseases of the mind, whatever the specific causes, both gone before they could see what their partnership would become. In 1914, Theo's remains were moved from Utrecht to Auvers. Now they lie side by side, their graves marked by identical headstones, covered by the same ivy. The brothers who could not survive without each other are together at last. When Theo died, his widow Johanna found herself alone with a 1-year-old son and hundreds of canvases that no one wanted. She was 28 years old. She had been married less than 2 years. She had no experience in the art world, no connections, no money beyond what Theo had left. A practical woman might have sold everything for whatever she could get. Johanna was practical, but she was also something more. She recognized that what she held was not merely property, but a sacred trust. She began, methodically, to build Vincent's reputation. It was slow work. The art world of the 1890s was not ready for his violent colors and emotional intensity. Critics who had dismissed him during his lifetime continued to dismiss him after death. Johanna persisted. She organized exhibitions. She lent paintings to museums. She cultivated relationships with sympathetic critics and dealers. She translated the letters from Dutch into French and English, making them accessible to a wider audience. The first major exhibition came in 1892, just 2 years after Vincent's death. It was modest, perhaps 20 paintings, but it attracted attention. Critics began writing about him with curiosity, then respect, then enthusiasm. By the turn of the century, Vincent van Gogh was becoming famous. Not yet the global icon he would become, but recognized, discussed, collected. The canvases Theo had been unable to sell were now sought after. Johanna lived until 1925. By then, Vincent was established as one of the masters of modern art. She had devoted 35 years to her brother-in-law's legacy, and she had succeeded beyond anything she could have imagined. She created the myth of the unrecognized genius, the artist who sells nothing during his lifetime and is celebrated after death. The world embraced it because it spoke to something deep in the human imagination, the hope that truth and beauty will triumph, even when they seem to fail. What became of the others? Eva Stricker, the cousin who said never, no, never, remarried and lived quietly. She died in 1918, having outlived Vincent by nearly 3 decades. Whether she ever looked at his paintings and wondered what might have been, we do not know. Margot Bergman, who swallowed strychnine rather than lose him, survived her suicide attempt. She lived another 30 years, dying in 1915 at 74. She never married. Paul Gauguin went on to fame of his own. He left France for Tahiti, seeking the primitive paradise he believed would inspire his art. He painted Polynesian women and tropical landscapes. He died in 1903 in the Marquesas Islands, alone and in debt. He never spoke publicly of that night in Alls. He took whatever he knew to his grave. Dr. Gachet kept the paintings Vincent had given him. He showed them to visitors, spoke of his famous patient with pride and sorrow. He died in 1909. The portrait Vincent painted of him eventually sold for $82 million, a gift from a dying man to a doctor who could not save him. And René Secretan, the teenager who may or may not have fired the shot that killed Vincent. He lived until 1957, dying at 83. In interviews late in life, he gave contradictory accounts of that July day. He never confessed. He never convincingly denied. The truth died with everyone who was there. Today, more than a century after his death, Vincent van Gogh is one of the most recognized artists in human history. The paintings that no one would by now hang in the greatest museums in the world. The Starry Night draws millions to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Sunflowers is synonymous with art itself. His face, the red beard, the bandaged ear, those intense pale eyes, is as famous as any celebrity's. During his lifetime, he sold one canvas for 400 francs. Now his works change hands for tens of millions of dollars. There is something absurd about these numbers. Vincent painted not for money, but because he had to, because the act of creation was the only thing that made his existence bearable. That his work should now command prices beyond comprehension is both vindication and cosmic joke. But the money is not what matters. What matters is what remains. More than 2,000 works, created in roughly 10 years. Letters that document every struggle, every hope, every failure and small triumph. A vision of the world that changed how we see color, emotion, the very act of looking. I want to touch people with my art, he wrote. I want them to say, he feels deeply, he feels tenderly. We say it now, more than a century too late, but we say it. He felt deeply, he felt tenderly. He gave everything he had. In the cemetery at Auvers-sur-Oise, two brothers lie beneath identical stones. Ivy covers both graves, tangling them together. The wheat fields spread golden below in summer, brown in winter, green with new growth in spring. Vincent van Gogh was born to replace a dead child. He spent his life trying to prove he deserved to exist. He failed at everything he attempted, until he found painting. And then he failed at that too, by every measure that mattered during his lifetime. But the measures changed. The world caught up. He wanted to touch people with his art. He succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined, beyond anything anyone could have imagined. The sadness lasted forever, as he predicted. But so did the stars.